Jake Morrison was not supposed to be here, floating in the darkness of space, with his ship falling apart around him, alarms screaming in every direction, while fire spread through the control panel in front of his face. The scout ship had been his home for 3 months since leaving Earth, exploring the outer edges of what humans called the frontier zone, looking for resources and maybe finding some answers about the strange signals that kept appearing on long-range sensors. Nobody expected a war. The first blast hit his port side engine without warning, tearing through the hull like paper, sending the small vessel spinning wildly through the void while Jake fought with controls that no longer responded to his commands. Outside the cracked viewport, he could see them now, massive ships that looked nothing like human vessels. Their hulls covered in what appeared to be organic armor that pulsed with blue and green light. They were fighting each other. 2 different types of ships, one side elegant and curved like living creatures made of crystal, the other side brutal and angular like insects built from dark metal and rage. Jake had stumbled into someone else's battle, and now he was paying the price. Another explosion rocked his ship, and this time the artificial gravity failed completely, leaving him floating in his seat while debris drifted past his head and the cabin filled with smoke. He tried to reach the emergency beacon, but his arm would not move right. Something warm and wet running down his sleeve, where shrapnel had torn through his flight suit. The ship was dying and taking him with it. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw one of the crystal ships moving closer, smaller than the others but faster, and on its back rode something that made his damaged mind question if he was already dead and dreaming a dragon. Not possible. His rational thoughts whispered. Dragons were myths from old Earth stories, creatures of fantasy that never existed outside human imagination. But there it was, massive wings spread wide against the stars, scales that shifted between red and gold in the light of distant suns, and on its back sat a figure in armor that gleamed like moonlight. The dragon moved with impossible grace through the vacuum of space, dodging weapons fire from the insect ships, while the rider directed it with subtle movements that spoke of perfect harmony between them. Jake's ship lurched again, and he realized with cold certainty that he was heading straight into a debris field, thousands of fragments from destroyed vessels creating a maze of death that his powerless ship could not avoid. He closed his eyes and thought about Earth, about the blue skies he would never see again, about all the things he had left unsaid and undone. Then something grabbed his ship. Not a tractor beam or magnetic lock, but something alive and strong, claws that punched through the hull near the cockpit and held the spinning vessel steady. The dragon had caught him. Through the cracked viewport, Jake could see the creature up close now, could see the intelligence in eyes that burned like molten gold, could see the rider leaning forward to look at him through the transparent metal. She was beautiful in a way that hurt to see, like staring at a star and knowing you could never touch it. Her face was similar to human but different in subtle ways, features too perfect and symmetrical, skin that held a faint luminescence, hair that fell in silver waves past shoulders covered in armor that looked grown rather than forged. Their eyes met through the barrier between them, and Jake felt something shift in his chest, some recognition he could not name. The rider spoke into a device at her wrist and gestured to others of her kind who flew nearby on similar dragons, all of them watching this strange scene with weapons ready. She pointed at Jake and then at her own chest, a gesture that seemed universal across species. He nodded, not knowing what else to do. The dragon pulled his ship close to its body, and then they were moving, faster than anything Jake had experienced, weaving through the battle with precision that defied physics. Energy weapons lit up the space around them, but the dragon avoided every shot, the rider anticipating each attack before it came, guiding her companion through the chaos like water flowing around stones. They left the battle behind and entered what looked like a calm zone, a pocket of space protected by hundreds of the crystal ships arranged in defensive formations. At the center sat a vessel so large it could have held a small city, its surface covered in towers and gardens that should not exist in vacuum, glowing with soft light that reminded Jake of bioluminescent creatures from Earth's deep oceans. The dragon carried him toward one of the landing bays, a huge opening in the ship's side where dozens of other dragons rested on perches that resembled trees made of light. As they entered the bay, Jake felt his dying ship shudder one last time before systems failed completely, leaving him in darkness and silence except for his own ragged breathing. The dragon set his vessel down with surprising gentleness, and the rider dismounted in one fluid motion, landing on the deck with barely a sound. Other figures approached, all similar to her, but none quite matching her presence, the way she moved with authority that needed no words. She gave orders in a language like music and wind chimes, beautiful and completely incomprehensible to Jake's ears. They opened his ship using tools that seemed to shape metal rather than cut it, peeling back the damaged hull like opening a flower. Cool air rushed in, and Jake gasped, his lungs burning from the smoke he had been breathing. Hands reached for him, many hands, pulling him free of the wreckage and laying him on the deck while lights scanned his body. The rider knelt beside him and removed her helmet, revealing the full impact of her alien beauty. She studied him with eyes that shifted color from violet to deep blue, intelligent eyes that saw more than just his physical form. She spoke again in her musical language, and this time placed one hand on his forehead, her touch cool and electric. Jake felt something probe his mind, not invasive, but curious. Like a gentle knock on a door asking permission to enter. Images flashed through his thoughts that were not his own, feelings and sensations that belonged to this strange woman looking down at him with an expression he could not read. Then she pulled back and spoke to her companions in what sounded like awe or surprise, gesturing to Jake while the others looked skeptical. One of them, a male with scars across his face and armor darker than the others, argued with her while pointing at Jake's ship and the battle still raging outside. The rider stood and her voice cut through the argument like a blade, sharp with command despite its musical quality. The scarred male bowed his head in submission, but his expression remained hostile. She turned back to Jake and did something unexpected. She smiled. It was a small smile, uncertain but genuine, and it transformed her face from alien and untouchable to someone who could be understood. She said something that sounded like it might be her name, a flowing combination of syllables that Jake's human tongue could never properly shape. He tried anyway, his voice rough from smoke, and she laughed, a sound like bells in wind. She repeated the words slowly, and he tried again, getting closer this time. Then she pointed at him with raised eyebrows, asking without words he understood and spoke his own name, watching her try to wrap her alien mouth around human sounds. She managed something close enough and seemed pleased with herself. Medical personnel arrived with equipment that hummed and glowed, scanning Jake's injuries while the rider watched over them like a protective guardian. The pain in his arm began to fade as they applied something that looked like living moss, but felt like cool water, knitting flesh back together with impossible speed. Through it all, the dragon waited nearby, its massive head turned to watch Jake, with the same intense curiosity its rider had shown. The creature made a sound deep in its chest, something between a purr and distant thunder. The rider noticed and her eyes widened, speaking quickly to her companions who looked equally surprised. She approached the dragon and placed her hand on its snout, closing her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. When she opened them again, she looked at Jake with an expression of wonder, mixed with something else. Something that looked almost like fear. She spoke to the group around her in low, urgent tones, and though Jake could not understand the words, he caught the feeling behind them. Disbelief, confusion, maybe even hope. One of the others, a female with kind eyes, asked what sounded like a question. The rider answered with words that made everyone go silent. She walked back to Jake and knelt beside him again, taking his hand in hers without asking permission. Her touch was warm now instead of cool, her grip firm as she looked into his eyes and spoke words he wished desperately he could understand. Whatever she said, it was important, maybe the most important thing she had ever told anyone. The scarred male made a disgusted sound and walked away while others whispered among themselves. The rider ignored them all. Her attention focused entirely on Jake as if he were the only person in the universe. She said something else, softer this time, and Jake saw her cheeks darken with what might have been a blush. Then she stood and gave orders that sent everyone into motion, medical staff taking Jake toward what looked like a medical bay, while the rider walked beside his floating stretcher, never leaving his side. As they moved through corridors that curved like the inside of seashells, Jake caught glimpses of a civilization beyond human imagination. Gardens growing in impossible places, water flowing upward in defiance of gravity, other beings moving through spaces designed for beauty as much as function. He had found something humans had always wondered about. They were not alone in the universe, and for reasons he could not begin to understand. This alien princess with her dragon companion had decided he was worth saving. What Jake did not know, could not know, was that in that moment when she first saw him through his cracked viewport, Princess Elira had experienced a vision that changed everything she had seen, futures branching like rivers, all the possible paths ahead. And in the ones where her people survived, where hope lived instead of extinction, he was there. This strange alien from an unknown species, this man with dark hair and eyes like Earth's sky, this Jake Morrison who had stumbled into her war by accident. He was important, and though every rational thought told her it was impossible, though prophecy was dangerous and futures were never certain, she had felt the truth of it down to her bones. She had turned to her honor guard with words that made them question her sanity. "That is my future husband," she had told them. "He just does not realize it yet." Jake woke in a bed that felt like sleeping on clouds, soft beyond anything human technology had created, and for a moment he forgot where he was or how he had gotten there. Then memory returned in a rush and he sat up quickly, too quickly, making his head spin. The room around him curved like everything else on this ship. Walls that glowed with soft light from no visible source. A viewport showing stars moving past in ways that suggested incredible speed. His arm no longer hurt. He pulled back the sleeve of the simple robe someone had dressed him in and found smooth skin where shrapnel had torn through flesh. Not even a scar remaining alien medicine was impressive. The door opened without sound, and she entered. The rider who had saved him, still wearing her armor. Though she had removed the helmet, Princess Elira, he had learned her name was, or something close to that pronunciation. She carried a tray with food and drink, setting it on a table that grew from the floor at her gesture. She spoke in her musical language and then seemed to remember he could not understand, frustration crossing her features. She pointed at the food, and then at her mouth, the meaning clear. Jake approached cautiously and examined what she offered. Fruits that looked almost normal, except for their blue and purple colors, bread that smelled like honey, liquid that sparkled like starlight in a crystal cup. He picked up one of the fruits, and she nodded encouragement. It tasted like strawberries mixed with something he had no reference for, sweet and slightly electric on his tongue. She smiled at his expression and relaxed slightly, sitting across from him while he ate. They spent an awkward few minutes trying to communicate through gestures and expressions, both of them laughing at the absurdity of their situation. Then she pulled out a small device and placed it between them on the table. It projected images in the air, showing Jake things she wanted him to understand. Her people, the Sylvani, were ancient beyond human reckoning, their civilizations spanning thousands of worlds. They had mastered biotechnology to the point where their ships and tools were grown rather than built. living things shaped to purpose through methods Jake could barely comprehend, and they were losing a war. The images showed the enemy, the brutal insect-like ships he had seen in battle, a species called the Kragoth, who consumed everything in their path. For 300 years, the Sylvani had fought them, watching world after world fall to the swarm, unable to stop the advance despite superior technology. The Kragoth had numbers beyond counting and no fear of death, each one connected to a hive mind that directed them with perfect coordination. Elira showed him battle after battle, elegant Sylvani tactics meeting wave after wave of Kragoth attackers who simply overwhelmed through sheer mass. She showed him worlds burning, cities falling, dragons dying. Her expression as she showed these horrors was carefully controlled, but Jake could see the pain behind her eyes. This was personal for her, not just duty but grief. When the images faded, she looked at him with a question in her alien eyes. Why was he here, alone in a tiny ship at the edge of their war? Jake wished he could explain properly, but settled for simple gestures. He pointed to himself, then out at the stars, making a sweeping motion. Explorer, he tried to convey, alone because humans were new to this region of space. She understood at least part of it, and her expression changed to curiosity. She pointed at him and said what sounded like a question. He caught one word that might have been her asking about his people. He nodded and activated his own device, a simple data pad from his ship that had somehow survived. He showed her images of Earth, of human cities and ships, trying to convey that his people were young compared to hers. She studied each image with intense focus, her fingers hovering over the projection as if wanting to touch these strange sights. When she saw images of human military vessels, her expression shifted, and she called others into the room. The scarred male from before entered with several others, all of them warriors by their bearing. They examined Jake's images with discussion that sounded like debate. The scarred male, whose name Jake learned was something like Vexus, pointed at the human ships and spoke with clear dismissal. Elira argued back, her voice sharp. Jake did not need translation to understand. They thought human technology was primitive, inadequate, and they were probably right by their standards. But then Jake noticed something in their projected battles that made him lean forward. He gestured for attention, and Elira quieted the others. Jake pointed at one of their battle formations, elegant and beautiful, ships arranged in patterns that looked like flowers or snowflakes. He made a gesture like an explosion, trying to show vulnerability. Vexus laughed without humor, but Elira watched closely. Jake pulled up images from Earth's own wars, the brutal conflicts that had nearly destroyed his world before they achieved space travel. He showed them human tactics, asymmetric warfare, ambush strategies, the willingness to abandon beauty for effectiveness. The Sylvani warriors went quiet. Studying these images of humanity's bloody history, Jake could see them beginning to understand. They fought with honor and grace. While the Kragoth fought with overwhelming numbers, humans had learned to fight dirty. Elira spoke to him directly, urgency in her voice. He caught enough meaning from her tone. She wanted his help. Jake pointed at himself and made a questioning gesture. What could one human do in a war between civilizations that had lasted centuries? She surprised him by taking his hand, her touch warm and electric like before. She spoke words he was starting to recognize the shape of even without understanding, earnest words that seemed to carry more weight than just military strategy. The device between them chirped, and suddenly words appeared in English, rough translations that the machine had puzzled out from context. The meaning came through imperfectly, but enough Elira was asking him to observe their next battle, to look with fresh eyes and find the weaknesses they could not see. She believed he could help them, believed it with a certainty that seemed to go beyond reasonable hope. Jake found himself nodding before thinking it through. What else was he going to do? Try to fly home in his destroyed ship? He was stranded in the middle of an alien war, might as well make himself useful. Elira's smile when he agreed was bright enough to light the room. She stood and gestured for him to follow. The next hours were strange beyond description, as Jake was fitted with armor that adjusted itself to his body, given weapons he had no idea how to use, and brought before a council of Sylvani leaders who studied him like an interesting specimen. Elira spoke on his behalf, her voice commanding in a way that reminded Jake she was not just a warrior, but royalty. The council seemed skeptical, but willing to allow this experiment. One elder, a woman with hair like silver waterfalls, asked Elira something that made the princess blush and respond sharply. Whatever was said, the elder smiled knowingly and the others looked amused. Vexus remained hostile, making his objections clear, but Elira overruled him with authority that could not be denied. Then they were moving, Jake following Elira through the massive ship to a command center that looked like a garden crossed with a military installation. Holographic displays grew like flowers from the floor, showing the entire battlefield in real time. The Kragoth were attacking again, a small fleet pressing toward a Sylvani supply convoy. Elira would lead the defense with her dragon riders, and Jake would observe from the command ship. She placed a headset on him that allowed him to see what she saw, to watch the battle through her eyes while staying safely behind. Then she was gone, running to the launch bay where Emberwing waited. Jake stood among alien commanders and watched through the neural link as Elira mounted her dragon and they launched into space. The connection was disorienting at first, but he adjusted quickly, able to see both the command displays and her direct view. The battle began with the grace he expected from watching the earlier recordings. Sylvani ships moved in coordinated patterns, dragons weaving between them like dancers, weapons firing in precise volleys. It was beautiful and completely inadequate. The Kragoth ships absorbed the damage and kept coming, more and more of them emerging from the debris field where they had been hiding. Jake watched the Sylvani formation hold its shape, even as enemies poured through gaps. He could see what they could not, blinded by their own discipline. He grabbed the communication device and spoke, knowing Elira's headset would translate his words. "Break formation," he urged, "scatter and regroup." Through the link he felt her confusion but also trust. She gave orders and the Sylvani forces broke apart, abandoning their beautiful patterns. The Kragoth ships, programmed to exploit formation weaknesses, suddenly had no clear targets. Individual dragons began hit-and-run attacks, striking from unexpected angles before retreating. The supply convoy used the chaos to accelerate away. Jake called out more suggestions, using tactics from human naval warfare adapted to three-dimensional space. Target their communications ships. Create dead zones in their network. Focus fire on single enemies rather than spreading damage. Use the debris as cover. Elira followed every suggestion and her forces followed her lead. The tide of battle shifted, and for the first time, Jake saw through her eyes what it looked like when Kragoth ships were actually destroyed rather than just damaged. The supply convoy escaped, and the Sylvani forces withdrew with minimal casualties. When Elira returned to the command ship, she was breathing hard, and her armor was scorched from near misses. But she was smiling like Jake had never seen anyone smile before. She pulled off her helmet and crossed straight to him, speaking rapidly to the commanders around them before turning to Jake with eyes shining. The translation device caught fragments. Victory, success. Human tactical innovation. Then she did something that surprised everyone, including Jake. She hugged him, alien armor against human borrowed armor, her face pressed against his shoulder for just a moment, before she pulled back with that same blush from before. The commanders looked shocked but pleased. Vexus looked like he wanted to strangle someone. Elira spoke formally to the council representatives present, and though Jake caught only pieces through translation, he understood the meaning. She wanted him given command authority, wanted to integrate human tactics into Sylvani strategy. The council representatives agreed to allow trials, testing these new methods. But their eyes, when they looked at Jake, held something else besides military consideration. They saw how their princess looked at this alien, the way she stayed close to him, the certainty in her voice when she spoke of him. And they wondered what prophecy she had seen that made her so sure. 3 months passed in what felt like 3 days. Jake learning the Sylvani language through devices that helped his brain process the musical sounds while teaching their warriors tactics that felt obvious to him but revolutionary to them. He commanded his first real battle on a Tuesday, at least what his internal clock still called Tuesday. Leading a mixed force of dragon riders and bioships against a Kragoth staging area, they won with fewer losses than any Sylvani victory in the past decade. Word spread through the fleet, and suddenly Jake Morrison was no longer just the strange alien Elira had rescued, but someone whose ideas saved lives. Warriors who had looked at him with suspicion now sought his advice. Commanders integrated his methods into their strategies, and Elira stayed by his side through all of it, translating when his language skills failed, supporting his authority when traditionalists pushed back, believing in him with an intensity that both comforted and terrified Jake. He was falling for her, and that was a problem. Not because she was alien. Jake had stopped thinking of her that way after the first week. She was just Elira, brilliant and fierce and kind, making jokes that still surprised him even through translation, showing him wonders of her civilization with childlike enthusiasm. The problem was the way everyone looked at them together, knowing smiles and whispered conversations. The problem was what he had learned about Sylvani seers and their visions. Elira had the gift of foresight, seeing possible futures branching like rivers. And she had told her honor guard something about Jake the day she saved him, something that made them treat him with deference mixed with amusement. He finally asked her about it one night as they worked late in the strategy room, analyzing Kragoth movement patterns. They were alone, most of the ships sleeping in whatever cycles the Sylvani kept. Elira was showing him maps of her homeworld, Luminara, when Jake interrupted. "What did you see when you first found me?" he asked in still imperfect Sylvani. "What vision made you so certain about helping me?" She went very still, her luminescent skin dimming slightly, and what he had learned meant strong emotion. For a long moment she said nothing, and Jake thought maybe he had crossed some cultural line. Then she spoke quietly, her eyes on the star maps rather than his face. She told him about the visions, about seeing thousands of possible futures every time she touched someone important to coming events. Most seers only got glimpses, fragments, but her gift was stronger. She saw futures in detail, lived entire possible lives in the space between heartbeats. It was a gift that felt more like curse. When she had seen Jake through his cracked viewport, she had experienced something that never happened before. Every future where the Sylvani survived, every timeline where her people found hope instead of extinction, he was there. Not just present, but central, his strategies and ideas changing everything. But more than that, in the futures where they won, where peace returned, he was beside her. Not as commander or advisor, but as partner, bonded in ways the Sylvani reserved for their deepest connections. She had seen them standing together on Luminara, watching human ships arrive to begin an alliance. She had seen them facing the Kragoth Queen in a battle that would decide everything. She had seen quiet moments between them, private and tender, futures where they chose each other. And she had spoken without thinking, overwhelmed by the certainty of those visions, telling her guards that he was meant to be hers, even though he did not know it yet. Jake listened to all this with a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to be angry at the presumption, at the idea that his choices were predetermined by alien prophecy. But another part, the part that had been drawn to her since that first moment, felt relief. He was not alone in this feeling. Elira finally looked at him, and her eyes held something he had not seen before: fear. She was afraid he would reject her now that he knew. Afraid he would think she had manipulated him, Jake surprised himself by laughing. Not cruel, but genuinely amused. He told her in his rough Sylvani that humans had a saying about fate versus free will. He did not believe in destiny forcing choices, but he did believe in choosing for himself, and he chose to be here, working beside her, caring about her people's survival. If prophecy and personal choice led to the same place, did it really matter? Which came first? Elira looked at him with wonder, and then smiled. That brilliant smile that made her alien features absolutely beautiful. She reached across the star map and took his hand. They stayed that way for a long time, fingers intertwined, not speaking because words were not needed. Then alarms shattered the peaceful moment. Kragoth forces, massive numbers, heading straight for the coordinates of a world Jake had not heard mentioned before. But he saw Elira's face go pale with terror and knew immediately this was different. Luminara, she whispered. They found Luminara. Her homeworld, hidden for decades behind defensive networks and false trails. Somehow the Kragoth had discovered its location. The ship erupted into organized chaos, warriors running to battle stations while commanders demanded information. Elira was already moving, pulling Jake with her toward the dragon bays. He had never seen her like this, all pretense of royal composure abandoned in raw fear for her people. They reached Emberwing, and she was calling orders, summoning every dragon rider in the fleet. Jake grabbed her arm and made her look at him. "How many Kragoth ships?" he asked. "Too many," she answered, voice shaking. "More than we have ever seen in one place." "Then we fight smart, not brave," Jake said, using a phrase he had taught her weeks ago. "Get me to the command center and trust me." Something in his voice cut through her panic. She nodded, and they ran together through the ship while it jumped to faster-than-light travel. The command center was already filled with council members and military leaders, all arguing about defensive positions and evacuation priorities. Jake pushed through them to the holographic displays and started pulling up everything he knew about Luminara's defensive network. Elira translated his rapid questions and orders, her voice steadying as she fell into the rhythm of command. Jake studied the approaching Kragoth force and felt his stomach drop. She was right. There were too many for conventional battle, but humans had not survived their own wars through conventional thinking. He started issuing orders that made the Sylvani commanders protest. "Abandon the outer defensive ring," he said. "Pull all forces back to Luminara itself," they objected. That would leave the Kragoth a clear path. "Exactly," Jake said. "We want them committed, want them thinking they have already won." Then he explained his plan, and even Vexus looked impressed, though the scarred warrior hid it behind skepticism. They would turn Luminara's own moon into a weapon, using it to disrupt Kragoth formations. They would hide ships in the planet's rings. Ready to strike from unexpected angles, they would make the enemy's numbers work against them in confined space. It was desperate and dangerous and required perfect timing, but it was a chance. The council approved, and orders went out to every ship in the fleet. Then they were there, dropping out of faster-than-light travel to see Luminara hanging in space like a jewel, all blues and greens and silver cities that sparkled in the light of twin suns, and beyond it, approaching like a dark cloud, the Kragoth Armada. Jake had never seen so many enemy ships, thousands of them, enough to blot out stars. Beside him, Elira was breathing hard, one hand on Emberwing's neck for comfort. The dragon made a low sound in its throat, sensing its rider's fear. Jake looked at her and saw not a princess or a seer, but someone facing the possible death of everything she loved. He took her hand, like she had taken his hours before. "We can do this," he said in Sylvani that was getting better every day. "Your people are not alone anymore." She squeezed his fingers so hard it almost hurt and nodded. Then she was moving, pulling on her helmet and mounting Emberwing with fluid grace. Jake wanted to call her back, wanted to tell her things he had not found words for yet, but there was no time. She launched with her dragon riders, hundreds of them, meeting the Kragoth advance with weapons blazing. Jake forced himself to focus on the tactical displays, calling maneuvers and coordinating forces. The battle was chaos. The Sylvani forces executed his plan perfectly, luring the Kragoth into the trap. The moon moved from its orbit, pushed by gravity generators, smashing through enemy formations. Ships hidden in the rings emerged to strike at flanks. Dragons wove through the carnage like needles, deadly and precise. But there were so many Kragoth. For every 10 they destroyed, 20 more pushed forward. Jake watched through command feeds as Sylvani ships began taking critical damage. He saw dragons falling, their riders dying in silence of space. And through the neural link he sometimes shared with Alira, he felt her anguish every time she lost someone under her command. Then something changed. The Kragoth stopped pressing forward and began retreating, pulling back in organized fashion that spoke of intelligence behind the hive mind. Jake frowned, studying their pattern. They were not beaten, not even close to defeated. So why retreat? Then he saw it, and horror flooded his veins. The Kragoth had circled ships around Luminara's far side, hidden behind the planet itself. While the Sylvani fought the main force, a second fleet had positioned itself to attack the defenseless cities below. It was a trap within a trap. Jake screamed into communications, trying to warn Elira, but she had already seen it, was already turning with her riders to race back. They would never make it in time. The Kragoth ships began their bombardment, and Jake watched helplessly as the beautiful cities of Luminara started to burn. Then something impossible happened. The Kragoth ships attacking the planet suddenly stopped firing and began turning on each other. Confusion spread through the enemy fleet as ship after ship went rogue, breaking from hive control. On the command displays, Jake saw energy signatures that made no sense. Someone was broadcasting a signal that disrupted the Kragoth network, but Elira's voice came through, breathless with shock. She had found the source. On Luminara's surface, a temple that had stood for thousands of years was glowing with light, ancient technology activating after millennia of sleep. The elders had spoken of old weapons from the last great war, but everyone thought them myths. Apparently, some myths were true. The disruption gave the Sylvani the opening they needed. Jake coordinated a full assault on the confused Kragoth forces, pressing advantage while they had it. The battle turned, and this time the enemy actually broke, fleeing in disarray, victory, but at terrible cost. Luminara burned in places. Though the disruption signal had saved most of the cities, dozens of ships destroyed, hundreds of warriors lost. Jake felt numb as casualty reports came in. Elira returned with Emberwing, her armor scarred and melted in places from near misses. She dismounted and walked straight to Jake. Without word, she collapsed against him, and he held her while she shook with exhaustion and grief. Around them, the command center celebrated survival. But Jake and Elira both knew this was just beginning. The Kragoth would return, and next time, they might not be so fortunate. The ancient temple on Luminara became the center of everything. Elders and scientists working day and night to understand technology their own ancestors had built and then forgotten. Jake stood in the main chamber studying holographic records that were older than human civilization, trying to piece together what had happened thousands of years before Elira worked beside him, translating text that even modern Sylvani struggled to read. What they discovered changed everything they thought they knew humans and Sylvani had met before. Not recently, not in living memory, but so far back it had passed from history into legend. The records showed cooperation between species, shared technology, combined forces fighting against the same enemy, the Kragoth. But back then, they had a different name and a different form, not quite the hive-minded swarm they had become. Something had changed them, transformed them from individual beings into the collective nightmare they were now. And the weapon that had done it, the technology that could reshape an entire species, was still out there somewhere. The records called it the Nexus, a station at the galaxy's heart where ancient peoples had gathered to share knowledge. But communication with the Nexus had ceased millennia ago, and everyone assumed it was destroyed or abandoned. The temple's activation signal suggested otherwise. Someone or something at the Nexus had responded when Luminara called for help. Jake looked at Elira and saw the same thought forming in her mind. They needed to find the Nexus, not just for weapons but for answers about what had happened to the Kragoth and maybe how to reverse it. The council was less enthusiastic about this plan when Elira presented it. Sending their best commander and the human advisor into unknown space, while the Kragoth regrouped, seemed like abandonment. But Elira stood firm, using her authority as crown princess to override objections. Her younger sister Lyra would coordinate defenses while they were gone. The girl was young but talented, and she had warriors like Vexus to guide her. Vexus himself protested most loudly, his scarred face twisted with anger as he argued with Elira in front of the entire council. Jake had learned enough to follow the argument. Vexus accused Elira of abandoning duty for personal attachment to the human. He suggested her visions were clouded by emotion rather than clarity. Elira's response was cold and sharp. She reminded Vexus that her visions had never been wrong, that every strategy Jake suggested had worked. Then she said something that made the scarred warrior go pale. Jake did not catch all the words, but he caught enough. Elira had seen Vexus in her visions too. Seen a future where his pain and rage led him down a dark path. She was warning him without actually accusing him of anything. The council voted and approved the mission, though many seemed unhappy about it. Preparations began immediately. Jake returned to his quarters to gather what little he owned, mostly Sylvani equipment he had been given. He found Lyra waiting for him, Elira's younger sister, who looked so much like her sibling, but with features that still held youth's softness. She spoke to Jake in careful Sylvani, wanting to make sure he understood. She asked him to protect her sister, said that Elira acted strong but carried too much weight alone. Jake promised he would, and Lyra studied him with eyes that saw more than her years suggested. She told him something that made him uncomfortable. She said that she had seen the way Elira looked at him and the way he looked back. She said that among their people such bonds were sacred and rare. She asked if humans felt the same way about such connections. Jake admitted he did not know Sylvani customs well enough to understand what she meant. Lyra smiled sadly and explained. When a Sylvani bonded with someone, truly bonded heart and mind, it was permanent. They became part of each other in ways that went beyond simple partnership. Breaking such a bond would damage both people, maybe permanently. She was telling Jake to be certain of his feelings before letting things progress further with Elira. He thanked her for the warning, and she left him with thoughts that kept him awake long into the ship's night cycle. Did he love Elira? The question felt too simple for what he felt. He admired her strength and respected her leadership. He enjoyed her company and missed her when they were apart. He wanted to protect her and make her smile. He thought about her constantly. Maybe that was love, or maybe it was just natural attachment to the person who had saved his life and given him purpose. He did not know, but he knew he was not ready to turn back now. The next morning, they departed on a smaller vessel, just large enough for 12 people and 1 dragon Elira commanded with ember wings secured in a special chamber. Jake served as tactical advisor along with a small crew of warriors and scientists. Among them was an elder named Kayla, ancient even by Sylvani standards, who had studied the old records all her long life. She spoke to Jake through translation devices since her dialect was too archaic for his learning. She told him things about the Nexus that were not in the public records. She said it was built by a coalition of species who feared what technology could become if misused. They created safeguards and limits, rules that all members agreed to follow. But one species, the ancestors of what became the Kragoth, had disagreed. They believed in progress without restriction, in evolution through any means necessary. The coalition had exiled them, and in revenge, they had found technology that transformed their entire species. They became the hive, individual minds sacrificed for collective power, and they blamed all other species for their isolation. That was why they consumed everything they encountered. Not for resources, but for revenge. Kayla's eyes were sad as she told Jake this. She said that war born from misunderstanding and pride was the worst kind, because everyone believed they were right. The journey took weeks through hyperspace routes that were poorly mapped. They encountered debris fields from ancient battles and strange anomalies that their sensors could not fully explain. Jake spent time with each crew member, learning their stories. There was a pilot named Mira, who flew with precision that impressed even him. A warrior called Torin, who had lost his bonded dragon but continued to fight. A scientist named Davin, who studied the Kragoth obsessively, trying to find weaknesses. And there was Emberwing, who had begun responding to Jake almost as readily as to Aelira. The dragon would press its massive head against Jake's chest and rumble contentedly when he scratched behind its horns. Aelira watched these interactions with expressions Jake had learned to read. She was pleased, but also puzzled. Bonded dragons did not usually accept others so completely. It meant something about Jake that even she did not fully understand. They grew closer during the journey, sharing meals and quiet moments between duty shifts. Jake's language skills improved to the point where they could have real conversations without translation devices. She told him about growing up on Luminara, about the pressure of being crown princess during an endless war, about watching friends and family die while her visions showed her futures that might never come. He told her about Earth, about humanity's near self-destruction, and the hope that had come from finally reaching the stars. About losing people he cared about in conflicts that seemed pointless in retrospect. They found common ground in their losses and their determination to prevent more. One night Jake asked her about the bond Lyra had mentioned. Aelira explained carefully, her luminescent skin glowing brighter with emotion. She said that Silvani could choose to form mental and emotional connections with others. It required both people to be willing, and it created a link that let them share feelings and thoughts. Most Silvani only bonded with their dragon companions, but sometimes, rarely, they bonded with another person. She admitted that she felt the beginning of such a connection with Jake. Their minds were already touching at the edges when they were close. She could feel his emotions sometimes, and suspected he felt hers, but she had not completed the bond, was waiting for him to understand fully what it meant. Jake processed this information with mixed feelings. Part of him was drawn to the idea of that closeness. Part of him feared losing himself in it. He told her honestly that he needed time to think. She accepted this with grace, though he saw disappointment in her eyes. Then they reached the nexus, and all personal concerns became secondary. The station was massive beyond comprehension, a structure that wrapped around a small star-like artificial planet. But it was dark, no lights or activity visible from distance. They approached cautiously, scanning for Kragoth presence or any signs of life. The station's automated systems responded to their hails, ancient machines stirring to life after ages of silence. A landing bay opened and they entered, Emberwing moving protectively close to the ship. What they found inside was beautiful and terrible corridors that seemed to stretch forever, technology that blended into art, evidence of dozens of different species having lived and worked here, but everything was covered in dust and silence. They had been abandoned, not destroyed. As they explored, Jake found human artifacts, proof that his species had been part of this ancient coalition. He found records in proto-languages that were ancestors of modern human speech. His people had been here, had been part of something greater, and then lost it all. Elira found Sylvani history that contradicted everything her people believed about their past. They had not evolved in isolation, but as part of a galactic community. The weight of all this lost knowledge pressed down on them. Then they reached the central chamber and found what they were looking for: the source of the signal that had disrupted the Kragoth at Luminara, a device that could broadcast across entire star systems, designed specifically to break hive mind control. But it was damaged, barely functional, only able to send one burst before failing, and standing in front of it was someone they did not expect to find: Vexus. The scarred warrior had somehow arrived before them. His own ship hidden in the station's depths. His expression when he saw them was not surprise, but resignation. He had known they would come. He had been counting on it. And as Jake looked at the weapon in Vexus's hands and the determination in his eyes, he understood with sinking dread Vexus was not here to help them. He was here to destroy the Nexus and everything in it. Even if it meant killing them all, Vexus stood before the ancient device with weapons ready and grief etched into every line of his scarred face, speaking in rapid Sylvani that Jake now understood well enough to follow. He had lost everything to the Kragoth, he said. His bonded dragon killed decades ago in a battle he barely survived. He had watched the war consume generation after generation with no end in sight. He had seen nobles like Elira make promises of victory while warriors like him did the dying. And he had decided that if they could not win the war, then they would end it. By destroying the Nexus and its technology, he would prevent anyone from using it, Sylvani or Kragoth. He would detonate the station's power core and the explosion would consume this entire system. No more ancient weapons to tempt species toward destruction, no more false hopes about peaceful solutions. Just an end to the cycle. Elira stepped forward with her hands raised in peace, trying to reach the warrior she had known for years. She spoke to him with compassion, acknowledging his pain while arguing against his plan. The Kragoth were not born as monsters, she said. They were transformed against their will. This device could free them, could restore their individual minds. They could end the war through liberation, not extermination. Vexus laughed bitterly. He said she was naive, blinded by her visions of impossible futures. He said the Kragoth were too far gone, too thoroughly transformed, and even if they could be freed, why should the Sylvani save them after centuries of slaughter? Justice demanded retribution, not redemption. Jake found himself speaking before thinking it through, his Sylvani still imperfect but clear enough. He told Vexus about Earth's history, about wars that seemed righteous at the time, about enemies who became allies when people chose understanding over vengeance, about how every cycle of revenge just created more suffering. Vexus turned his weapon toward Jake with contempt. What did a human know about their war? About centuries of loss. Jake had been here for months, while Vexus had fought for decades. The human had no right to judge. Jake agreed he had no right, but he had the perspective of an outsider who had seen this pattern before, and he knew that destroying this station would not bring back Vexus's dragon or anyone else they had lost. It would just ensure more people felt the same pain. Vexus's hand trembled on his weapon. For a moment, Jake thought he had reached him. Then alarms began screaming through the ancient station. Kragoth ships had arrived, massive numbers of them, surrounding the Nexus. Someone had led them here. Jake looked at Vexus with understanding and horror. The warrior had not come alone to destroy the Nexus. He had made a deal with the Kragoth Queen herself. He would give them Elira and the secret of the Sylvani's dragon bonds. In exchange, the Queen would ensure her forces died with the station. Vexus believed he was sacrificing himself to save his people. Elira looked at her former comrade with betrayal sharp as any blade. She asked how he could do this, how he could become exactly what they fought against. Vexus said simply that he was tired of fighting, tired of losing. tired of hope that never delivered. He just wanted it to be over. Then the Kragoth began boarding the station, and choices had to be made quickly. Their small crew could not fight off an army. Jake looked at the device, at Vexus, at Aelira, and an idea formed. It was desperate and probably impossible, but desperate was what humans did best. He told Aelira through the mental connection they had been building. She understood immediately, and her eyes widened. It was insane. It was also their only chance. Aelira moved while Vexus was distracted by Kragoth approaching. She placed her hands on the device and opened her mind fully, using her seer abilities in ways she had never attempted. She reached through the device toward every Kragoth on the station and in the ships above. She showed them what Vexus had shown her about their history. She showed them visions of who they had been before the transformation. Individual beings with hopes and dreams and choices. She showed them possible futures where they were free. The strain was immense, her body shaking with effort. Jake felt her pain through their connection and did something instinctive. He grabbed her hand and added his own mental strength to hers. He did not have her gift, but humans had imagination, and he poured every ounce of it into showing the Kragoth what freedom looked like. The device amplified their combined effort and broadcast it across all Kragoth frequencies. For the first time in centuries, the hive mind stuttered. Individuals began remembering themselves. Ships stopped mid-attack as pilots regained control. Warriors on the station froze, confusion replacing hive certainty. Vexus watched with shock as his careful plan fell apart. The Kragoth were not mindless monsters. They were prisoners in their own bodies, slaves to the Queen's control, and they were waking up. The Queen herself arrived then, her massive ship dwarfing all others. She was ancient and powerful, and she was terrified. Losing control of the hive meant losing everything she had built. She broadcast commands that tried to overwhelm Aelira's signal. The battle became mental rather than physical. Queen's will versus Princess's vision. With Jake's creativity bridging the gap, Emberwing sensed his rider's distress and entered the chamber, the dragon adding its own presence to the mental struggle. Other dragons from the crew did the same, and something impossible happened. The dragon's mental bonds resonated with the device, amplifying it beyond anything its creators had intended. The signal reached across star systems, touching every Kragoth everywhere. The hive mind shattered like glass. Billions of beings suddenly remembered they were individuals. The shock was overwhelming. Ships crashed as pilots forgot how to fly in coordination. Warriors collapsed as the Queen's commands stopped flowing. And the Queen herself, having defined her existence through control, found herself alone in her own mind for the first time in millennia. She could not bear it. Her ship began self-destructing. Better to die than face the horror of what she had done. But Aelira, even exhausted and bleeding from the mental strain, reached out one more time. She showed the Queen a vision of redemption, of spending her remaining years helping undo the damage she had caused, of teaching freed Kragoth how to be individuals again, of choosing something besides revenge or death. The Queen hesitated, her ship's countdown paused, then accepted. A mental acknowledgement of guilt and responsibility. The Kragoth forces began standing down, freed beings looking around in confusion, seeing enemies and wondering why they had been fighting. Some fled, overwhelmed by sudden autonomy. Others approached carefully, seeking understanding. On the station, Jake caught Aelira as she collapsed. The effort had nearly killed her, but she was smiling. They had done what seemed impossible. They had ended a centuries-old war without destroying anyone. Vexus knelt on the floor, weapon fallen from numb hands. He had been so certain that violence was the only answer. Now he watched Kragoth and Silvani regarding each other with confusion instead of hatred. Aelira approached him with Jake's support. She told him gently that his pain was real and valid, but pain did not have to define him. He could choose to help build what came next. Vexus wept. The first tears he had allowed himself in decades. He asked how he could ever be forgiven for his betrayal. Elira said, forgiveness was not hers, alone to give. He would need to earn it from those he had endangered, but she would give him the chance. The weeks that followed were chaos of the best kind. Freed Kragoth needed help learning to be individuals. Sylvani needed to adjust to enemies becoming neighbors. Humanity's fleet arrived, drawn by signals from the Nexus, and Admiral Kate Hayes listened to Jake's report with amazement. She brought news that Earth was ready to join this galactic community to share their knowledge and learn from others. The Nexus slowly came back to life as multiple species worked together to restore it. Human engineers combined with Sylvani biotechnology and freed Kragoth technical skills. They created something none could have achieved alone. Jake and Elira stood in the restored central chamber months later, watching the station function as it had been designed to a place where different peoples could meet and share. Elira turned to Jake and spoke without words through their bond. She asked the question that had waited all this time. Would he complete the bonding with her? Would he choose to be connected permanently? Mind and heart and future. Jake felt the weight of that choice. It meant staying here, becoming part of Sylvani's society. It meant binding himself to someone from another species. It meant changing who he was fundamentally. But it also meant never being alone again. It meant being part of something greater than himself. It meant choosing love over fear. He answered through their mental link with images instead of words. He showed her his acceptance, his commitment, his love. Elira's joy was bright enough to feel across the station. They completed the bond there in the chamber, witnessed by humans and Sylvani, and freed Kragoth. Their minds merged at the deepest level, creating a connection that would last their lifetimes. When it was done, Jake could feel Elira's presence always, a warmth in his thoughts. She could sense his feelings, his dreams, his essence. Emberwing rumbled approval and wrapped them both in one massive wing. The dragon had known from the beginning what they were to each other. Later, at a ceremony blending traditions from all three species, they were formally recognized as bonded partners. Elira wore the title of Crown Princess. Jake accepted the role of consort and human ambassador. Together, they would help shape the new era of cooperation. Lyra teased her sister privately, reminding her of those first words. "That is my future husband," Elira had said. "He just does not realize it yet." Elira laughed and admitted she had been right. Jake said he was glad he had not realized it at first. It meant he got to choose her for himself rather than feeling forced by prophecy. Elira kissed him and agreed that choice mattered more than fate. They stood together on observation deck, watching ships from dozens of worlds arrive. Human vessels bringing supplies and scientists, Sylvani ships carrying diplomats and artists, even Kragoth ships carrying beings learning to be themselves again. And everywhere the dragons flew, no longer tools of war but symbols of the connections between species. Jake held Elira close and marveled at how far he had come, from lost pilot in a dying ship to consort of alien princess, from outsider to bridge between civilizations, from human to something more. Elira rested her head on his shoulder and shared through their bond a vision, not of the future this time, but of the present. Two beings from different worlds who had found each other against all probability, who had chosen love over fear and